Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jessica Liss, and I'm Director of Operations and a contributor here at Payload. And for those who aren't familiar with us, we're a space media startup covering the business and policy of space. We have our flagship daily newsletter that I'm sure many of you found out about this through, also our weekly podcast and socials. This webinar today is brought to you by Epsilon 3 and Laura here, they're working at the forefront of streamlining and modernizing all things space operations and management. So today we have here a set of rockstar panelists from Epsilon 3, Stoke Space, Axiom, and Venus Aerospace. So I see no reason why we shouldn't just dive right into them telling us about themselves and their businesses. Laura, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, you already kind of kicked it off for me, and I don't really have much else to say other than, really excited to hear from these three other awesome people here. And, I'm really excited to support a lot of really awesome companies on the forefront of the new space economy that we are really excited to be helping build. So Epsilon 3 helps people manage their space operations from procedural content to operational decision-making and personnel. So there are a lot of really cool things on the forefront that we are working on, but I'm going to just turn it over to Anthony because, go ahead.
Sure. So hello, everyone. My name is Anthony Carboni. I'm the current lead of mission planning and operations software over at Axiom Space. What that really means is that I'm charged with establishing our mission planning process and how that works for all of our the missions we're undertaking with both our private astronaut missions and our Axiom station development and execution of that later on. I'm also going to be building up our planning team, figuring out how they're all going to be set up and organized to support that process, and also working on the different software we'll be using to actually plan the mission, execute the mission, and evaluate afterwards to make sure that everything happened according to our plans and see how we can improve from there. I've been in spaceflight for about 6 years now. I spent the first half going through certifications over at NASA with their operations planning flight control room position. And I went and I led the operations planning team for Expedition 65 last year, and that was a very exciting time. And if you're unfamiliar with what Axiom Space does, is we're working on the private astronaut missions. We conducted the first private astronaut mission on ISS earlier this year, and we have our second one planned for about mid next year in 2023. And then working on flying our Axiom station here in the near future as well, and establishing that as a nice platform to do really innovative science in the Earth orbit in the future. And I can hand it over to Hannah.
Hi, I'm Hannah McCallum, and I currently work for Venus Aerospace. Venus is one of the new startups. We are working on building a hypersonic vehicle with the goal of having you be able to be home for dinner. So think LA to Tokyo in an hour, be able to travel across the world. And we believe that just the ability to open up this type of travel for everyone will really help impact and change everything. And honestly, operations will be a huge part of all of this. And so my background is I was working in the launch vehicle space for 7 years, and then I switched over to Venus for about 1.5 years now. And I'm really excited to work on our mission, I guess.
And I'm Andy from Stoke. Founded the company a couple of years ago. We are building fully rapidly reusable rockets tailored to, for now, non-human payloads. So that adds a different customer-centric view on how we function and operate through mission planning. But right now we are in vehicle development mode, looking hard and focused on solving the reusable upper stage problem in a way that is rapidly reusable. So we think very hard about a 24-hour turnaround. What are the things that you have to do during that period? And very importantly, maybe more importantly, what are the things that you are not allowed to do in that 24-hour period? So things like detailed inspections or engine flushes or refurbishments and things of that nature. You just simply can't possibly do those things if you're going to turn a vehicle around in 24 hours. And so you have to design and architect with that in mind. And then the second part of it is, what do you have to do between missions? And there is still a whole lot that you have to do in payload integration and mission operations, obviously, first and foremost in that window of time. So that's where we're at.
Thank you, everyone, for the intros. All very interesting. So I should also mention before we get into our set of questions that the second half of this webinar will be focused on Q&A from the audience. So feel free to send questions at any time throughout the conversation, but they will be addressed later on. So yeah. So with that, let's dive right in to talking about mission management at all of these lovely startups and more established institutions. So how are missions managed at your companies today, and how in general do you compare that to some of your previous experiences? Let's just see what everyone or all of you think about the current kind of state of best practices. And we can start with Anthony.
Sure. Yeah, no, happy to start off. So, looking at Axiom Space, we're still in the startup phase and getting our feet wet with undertaking some missions. I mentioned earlier we had our first private astronaut mission. Not only was that a first for us, but that was a first for the world, right? So that was a new venture where it's not just government astronauts or government people going to space to accomplish the mission. So we were trying to undertake that, and that helped us learn where we can start pushing on different boundaries and how we can get really a commercially viable environment in low Earth orbit. We encountered a handful of roadblocks that we had to just discuss with NASA about going through for AX-1, about how we actually operate and how we plan the mission, even down to the finer details of like physically how do we get a plan input from my team over to their team. And so that was something that we had to overcome for that. And so just learning about that initial take and moving forward for our future missions, we're taking those lessons learned and advancing how we're structuring our support teams, how we're structuring our solicitation from our customers about the information that we're requesting from them at those different deadline deliverables as well. So we're trying to make sure that, especially if we're doing these missions in a relatively short turnaround versus, the NASA missions are planned out years in advance. Who your crew complement is going to be quite some time ahead. We're getting assigned a contract and executing the mission in about a 12-month period. So going from contract signing to execution is a pretty short time frame to wrap stuff around. So we're figuring out how to evolve in that way. And then we're also trying to make sure that we're really customer focused too. It adds a lot of different levels whenever it's not a government astronaut, right? So not only do you have the person sponsoring the private astronaut or the national astronaut in your missions, you have the actual individual itself, the crew member, right? And so their experience from the time that they sign on to want to fly to all the way through flight itself is something that's on our minds at all times, figuring out how do we make sure that not only are they going to enjoy the experience in flight, but how do they enjoy the experience that it takes to actually train to go through and be ready to fly. They spend months in advance of that flight to just figure out how to actually to do their mission that they've been wanting to do. And we've all been sitting through various training seminars and training scenarios at our own companies and at various previous companies. And it's not terribly exciting at times, even that's for a job that you're really excited about. And so trying to make sure that experience is elevated for them is something that we're actively trying to figure out how to do. And I think I want to touch a little bit about how that compares to previous companies. So coming from NASA spaceflight, I think one thing that's really interesting is that ISS has been continuously crewed pretty much nonstop for almost 22 years, or at least over 21 years. And they've been trying to increase their tempo over time without ever taking a break. And I think what's interesting about that is it's really difficult to foster a lot of growth whenever you're continuously working nonstop and your workforce is completely tied up in those resources of actually trying to operate and execute what the current mission is. And if you're always operating a mission, there's not enough breathing room to figure out and stop and evaluate how can we really improve. And so between our private astronaut missions and even when we get to our Axiom Station missions, it's going to be kind of a nice breather to have a small breaking point between completion of one mission to start of the next mission. Allows us to actually catch up and learn from things and actually establish a new process to make it an even better experience for the next time.
Does anyone want to jump in, or I will pick one?
I can go next, I guess. I guess the way that we look at mission management from our past and other people within our company is this is really a shepherding of customer and launch vehicle from the moment of launch service agreement all the way to satellite separation. And so it's a really end-to-end customer-centric role, but it's also a lot of technical management as well. So, you're doing things like coordinating launch windows, specific launch windows, and some customers are more demanding, like if you have to dock with ISS, there's very specific needs, and other customers, not so much. There's technical requirements that the launch vehicle needs to see to make sure that the spacecraft is flight worthy and everybody else is comfortable. If there's a ride share scenario, which is more and more common, then there's an integration and a coordination with a whole host of different customers that has to go on. The launch vehicle itself, as the industry evolves, we're starting to get more and more reliable and repeatable and predictable. And that's ultimately where we want to get. But the reality is, there's some amount of readiness and availability and risk associated with launch vehicles. So that it also needs to be clearly communicated in a way that is, I guess, as customer friendly as possible. Sometimes those messages aren't always easy to deliver, but we're all in it together. So the launch vehicle has to fulfill its obligations. The customers have to fulfill their obligations in terms of demonstrating their payload is ready and suitable to go, especially if you're sharing space with other customers as well. There's some deployment logistics. People may share a ride to space, but they may not all be going to the final location, or the common final location. So that has to be worked through. And so I would say that this whole process right now is relatively high touch, and that's okay. Where we want to go is maybe more of a standard, let's say UPS shipment, right? Where we can take something and deliver it with not a lot of high touch overhead. But yeah, right now I'd say it's half customer service and half technical management that has to be done in a way that's really tailored to each individual customer.
So I guess when it comes to Venus, one of the fun things that we're doing is we're really looking at speeding up the time between, for lack of a better word, flights, right? We're trying to be able to have a commercial vehicle that will operate similarly to an airplane for frequency. And so a lot of the things that we're working on and a lot of the processes that we're working on are involving how can we get things faster? How can we optimize the processes and the procedures to be able to take off, from a standard airport and then have a quick turnaround so that you don't have people waiting for their flights for a really, really long time. And just the operational side of that's going to be very complicated and very fun to figure out. And I think that the opportunities that we have using the various products that are now available is really, really, really helpful. And compared to my previous life where I was working in launch vehicles, it's just a very different mindset where you have to be very people focused and be able to optimize our procedures to maximize people's time and optimize time like on the ground in an airport, because you don't really want to have to sit there fueling a essentially an airplane for the same amount of time that you sit there and fuel a rocket. For those of you who watched the SLS launch last night, as you could have seen, there was a lot of time spent filling up that rocket. Granted, it's huge, but there's a lot of different processes in that. And so we're trying to figure out a good way to bring a little bit of the best of both worlds into an aircraft that can travel around the world.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think as we start doing things more and more often, we have to look at ways we can save people time. So, you know, as you have more private astronaut missions, as you have more launches, as you have more, you know, aircraft taking off from, for lack of a better word, for Venus. But, you know, I spent 17 years working in space operations and mostly in launch vehicles and human spacecraft and things that went to the ISS. But I see a lot of parallels in how we are going from processes like, you know, Andy was saying, you know, customer service oriented, you know, what is your requirement for this time frame? When do you need delivery of this? Did you test these things? To how do we automatically know via UPS? Like I received this box, here are all the things. I can just plug it in because here I've already shared all of the information I need to know about this payload, and I know that it's good to go. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of movement in this arena as we are all kind of developing our systems to the next generation, I think. So, yeah.
That is the perfect segue into our next question. So none of us here are strangers to completely transforming practices and innovating expected boundaries of established space practices. So what is changing about the way space missions are managed as more and more companies come onto the scene and as more private citizens and private even capital is involved?
I can take that a little bit. So for us, what Axon's really trying to focus on our personnel footprint. You know, like just to put it into perspective, the team that I was on over at NASA, the planning team, it took about minimum 11 planners to staff a single day of operations over for ISS, and that's just for one simple day for a busy time frame with a lot of dynamic events. You could have 15, 18 people on a single day just staffing for just the planning console, not the other systems, controllers, and everything else that goes along with it. So when you think of that, that's literally hundreds of people for just a single day of operations, which from a company perspective, that's a huge cost that's incurred to get that running. So we're really trying to figure out in tailoring our operations to have a very lean team, and the way to really do that is a couple different ways. Is having good data and information really readily available to those that are working, right? So like you want your flight controllers and your operators and everyone else having very pertinent information at the right time that they need it in a way that's easy to digest. You could have a whole screen of telemetry, and sure, that tells you all the information that you need, but at certain critical points, it'd be nice if the software pointed you directly to what the problem that you're trying to solve is, without having to navigate and find it yourself and use your own interpretations, where it could be as straightforward as this specific battery is over temp, and go off and troubleshoot that problem, versus looking at all your different temperatures and scanning everything else and doing your own evaluations. So having good information and reliable data readily available is really critical. That's where the different software solutions really come in handy to making that a reality. For procedure execution too, figuring out how to stay in sync with our crew members whenever they're performing operations on board. Right now there's limited camera and bandwidth availability for to watch their physical operations in space. So being able to monitor their digital presence is something that's important to us, and that's one of the reasons why looking at with Epsilon 3 having the kind of collaborative sense of a procedures tool makes a lot of sense, right? Because then you can see directly what's actually actively being worked on between various collaborators. It makes it more efficient without having to do various call downs. Now you're executing your operations faster, and then you're not having to ask as many questions or looked in different ways. So that's really what for us, that's kind of how we're figuring out how to manage our missions better. It's through our personnel footprint.
I think something that comes to mind in this arena is training. I spent many years in training and training people for space missions, and I think the thing that always comes to mind for me is, how do you reduce training for people, and how do you reduce the number of things people have to memorize or analyze and or do? And so whatever we can do to either make training more efficient, make it unnecessary, so that if somebody sits down to support a mission, they, let's say Andy has someone that's new and they want to get up to speed as quickly as possible. The fastest they can get up to speed, the better, especially for smaller and smaller companies, which, we're seeing pop up all over the place. I think that's something that we have to seriously look at.
Yeah, so building on that, I think, you can kind of roll it all up and say, find ways to abstract away the complexity, right? And, as an extreme example of that, something like GPS is fantastically complex, right? But it's been over time abstracted away to something where, maybe not I, but somebody without a lot of training can write a pretty cool app that uses GPS in real time, to do a whole lot of things. And that's due to multiple levels of abstraction. So as our industry matures, that's, the type of things that you want to look for. And for us as a launch vehicle, we look very critically at ways that we can abstract away complexity or automate complexity. So we work with companies like Laura's to do that on the test and operations side. We also build our own tools to make that easier as we go through R&D, manufacturing, production, and operations. So I think that's really important, and that's going to be a big thing, not only for our industry, but for hardware in general. And then the other thing I think for, the way the future of space missions are managed, you really have to think about the world, a lot, very similar to what Hannah was describing, where you can go pretty much any place at any time, right? That's the way we get around the world. With aircraft, you can get a ticket usually next day to go pretty much anywhere you want to go.
Unless it's Thanksgiving or Christmas.
Unless it's Thanksgiving or Christmas. But in general, if you at a very high level, that's pretty incredible that you can buy a ticket pretty much anywhere in the world for maybe a few $100, couple $1,000 tops to go anywhere you want to go at any time. And I think more and more we're going to get there to that place in space. But in order to do it, you need the availability, and you need the the demand signal to support launches anywhere at any time. And I think you get there by reusable vehicles that are designed to fly at a high cadence, so that you can drop cost and improve availability, and kind of get into this kind of virtuous flywheel that the industry has talked about for decades, but we haven't quite gotten to, and we're starting to move the needle there, which is really, really exciting. So that's one thing. And then the second thing I would say is, you really want to commoditize and, again, abstract away the complexity of integrating payloads into vehicles and then deploying them on orbit. So what does that mean? What does that look like? I think one of the things that looks like is we have to get comfortable, let's say, shipping air, right? So Jeff Bezos is famous for saying that Amazon is the world's leader in shipping air, right? And that's boxes that are not completely full. And right now, cost is still rare enough, or launch is still rare enough and still expensive enough where people are very uncomfortable shipping air, right? So like doing an incomplete mission or a payload manifest that's not full, let's say, right? But if we can get there, if launch is available enough and cheap enough, then people are comfortable shipping air. And now you can imagine a world where maybe you have containers and you can put a satellite in there, and maybe they don't go through as rigorous a testing process. But if they do fail on launch, it's self-contained, so you're comfortable with it, right? Different things like that. That's just a wild idea. But what you want to do is commoditize this process so the payload integration steps can be as fast as possible, or maybe they're done in parallel with other vehicle operations so that you can, get a head start of those, and then the vehicles can turn around quick, things like that. But that's the way I think we all have to think, because, as Hannah said, a vehicle on the ground is not making money for anybody. We need these things flying.
Yeah, and then kind of stepping back a little bit, having products like Epsilon 3 really helps the entire build cycle of a vehicle, because it can be applied to everything from assembling your product. It's really good to have the same tool set that can manage your manufacturing, that can manage your test operations, and then can manage your actual flight operations. And so having a single tool where someone can log on and look at an entire history of a part, all the way up through where it's currently at on a flight vehicle or on operations, and keep track of that, that's immensely powerful. And at least historically, in the places that I've worked before, there were sets of tools, and I mean sets, like 5, 6, 7 sometimes, in order to keep track of everything. And half of it boiled down to going back to a spreadsheet to see where this piece had been used. So having a tool that you can look at the initial steps that had it from machining to assembly, to getting it on a test stand for initial checkouts, to getting it onto a vehicle, that is something that is really, really powerful. And these types of tools are the only way that we'll be able to increase cadence, increase flight time, increase everything in the future.
Yeah, and adding a little bit to that, Hannah, for me, like with having a space station that's going to be sustaining for decades, right? Like knowing that this assembly that we built on the ground and the process of which it was done, and then the history of how that procedure was, if there was a small defect that happened to occur during development, but it passed all the quality assurance tests and safety checks, but it still had a small defect, we know that. That's tracked there, right? And then whenever it flies and there's a problem later on, we can go back and maybe even that's the easy path to our solution to solving the problem, is it's already listed there, and it's very quick, and it makes that troubleshooting process easier and more intuitive by having that history and that connection tied with everything.
Laura, would you want to tell us about some of the problems you've experienced throughout your career that led to the creation of Epsilon 3? After hearing some feedback.
Yeah, and thanks everyone for saying awesome stuff. We're really honored to be supporting you all, and hearing your feedback here is really makes me super happy. But I guess going back to Northrop, I know Anthony, you can probably relate to some of these things, and Andy likewise. Hannah, I'm sure you can probably relate the number of tools. We were using equipment and using processes that were designed when our spacecraft were built, long before I was alive, and there were a lot of things that I would have wanted to do better. I learned a lot about how missions were designed before I was born, and it worked efficiently, but we still had 5 people to manage one asset, and 5 people working 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, and that isn't really feasible for a small company. So when I transitioned over to SpaceX, I was given sort of blank slate here. You need to train the operations team. And we developed some kind of platform, which was basically a PDF scraper that synchronized the team. And that was sort of the first aha moment. And I don't have to use voice communications to tell everybody what I'm doing. And learning there how we went from 40 people in the control room to 3 to most people on call. And then finding out what the rest of the industry was doing and had been doing. Because when I was at SpaceX for those 10 plus years, I didn't really understand what was happening in the space industry, which was there were startups popping up everywhere, and startups don't have resources to build internal tools like a large company does. And so startups just went with what they had, what they knew, which was I'm going to use the word Microsoft Word or Confluence or something that I already have, which is OneNote, any of the suite of tools that most have been all mentioned already. And a lot of the problems people were telling me they had after I left SpaceX are why we started Epsilon 3 a couple of years ago, and really honored to be solving problems for all of you and a bunch of you out in the world listening. So if you have any questions, happy to answer.
Thanks, Laura. That's great background. So we're well on our way to solving some of these current challenges through companies like Laura's, as well as efforts from mission planning teams within companies. But looking further down the line, to a point where launch perhaps is commoditized, whether that's the 2030 plus or whenever that occurs, what are the next set of challenges that need to be solved for us to get there, apart from getting to space on Thanksgiving?
I think it's rapid reusability, Andy, right? And a lot of the manufacturing side. Yeah, you're on it, right? A lot on the manufacturing side. There's been a lot of problems in the supply chain. So I know a lot of other people are working on supply chain issues. Those are the biggest problems I'm seeing.
I think there's also the destination, right? So we alluded to, or Andy mentioned that sometimes your payloads don't always have the same destination. So having an option for your destination to even go to is something that's not currently readily available, right? So like if you want to do crewed space flights and have an astronaut, right now there's only there's a couple. There's the Chinese space station and there's ISS, right? Like those are the two locations you want to go in orbit to have a person in space for some period of time. Those are only two options, and one's more accessible than the other. And having Axiom Station being put up as another reliable source for people and destination for people to come to is very critical in facilitating and fostering more growth. Because as we have that, we'll need to have a series of different launch vehicles for cargo transports, from crew transports, and everything else that might be in between. Having a quick and reliable turnaround for a lot of that is super critical as well. But I think the destinations part is going to be a real challenge. But that's why it's great to see some of that start coming into fruition. The orbital reef passed their initial design review, I believe, not too long ago, and then we're well along in our design review processes, and we're going to start manufacturing and flying here very shortly for our station. And once those get put out there, it's really going to open up a lot of opportunities, I think.
I think, on this topic, we've talked about availability, the ability to go to any orbit at any time. I think, to me, that's really important to unlock all of the potential that we have in space. And I guess there's two analogies that I'll use to describe that view. The first one is, I think if you abstract or zoom out on our place in the world, our ability to access space right now really resembles closely what I guess intercontinental travel looked like not very long ago. 250 years ago, we were sailing around on wooden tall ships, right? And in that world, it's just impossible to imagine that you would outsource manufacturing overseas. You'd never do it because it's slow, expensive, and unreliable. But that is very similar to our relationship with space right now. And if you can knock that down, if you can, make costs much lower, if you can go anywhere at any time, then space is a great resource for a whole number of things. In fact, it's, I think, a necessary pillar of our civilization to continue to scale in a way that's meaningful and interesting to us without destroying our home planet, right? So not only is it a powerful and exciting area of an expansion, but I think it's necessary and we've got to get on it. So that's part one. And then part two is, let's see, what was part two? Now I'm blanking. Yeah, come back to me. Let me get my thought back together.
I wanted to add one other thing, which was, I think not right now, but maybe in the not so distant future, we might have a challenge in personnel, because I see less and less people getting really excited about space. We talked a little bit about the launch yesterday. I was with a group of people for dinner yesterday evening, and none of them knew about SLS. And not so many years ago, when I was participating in the first cargo mission from SpaceX to the space station in 2012, nobody knew. There were many people that I talked to that didn't know people lived in space. And I think us, as part of this industry, getting out and talking to young people is really important for kind of the future of our industry, getting people excited about what we're doing, excited about what we're going to do. Because I see less and less people kind of wanting to go into this field. People want to go into Bitcoin and Ethereum, and I had,
Maybe last week, Laura.
maybe last week, maybe not.
Yeah.
Yes, maybe not this week,
for the
but
space industry.
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You ask young people these days, what do you want to do? And nobody says, I want to be an astronaut anymore. I mean, 5-year-olds maybe, but not 15-year-olds. And so I see that as a future problem that I'd like to get ahead of personally.
Well, and I think also some of it comes down to safety. I had the opportunity to attend an exhibit at the California Science Center where they had an ISS exhibit there. And at the end of it, they had note cards and then little things like little tokens where you could use to vote, with the question being, do you think we should pursue human spaceflight? And this is very relevant because it was a bunch of students who would go through and do the voting and then write on their little note cards what they thought. And I was curious. And so I browsed through the note cards that, were everything from elementary school students to high school students. And one of the most common themes that I saw was a concern about human life with exploration, saying, I don't think humans should go to space because it's very dangerous and people will probably die if we do that. And that's historically, if you look at all of the crazy travel, like on the ships across the world, anytime there was some major exploration or change, that was true. There was actually a risk to human life. So I think one of the things that the space industry really should focus on is the safety aspect. And some of that comes down to rockets these days are designed to be on the exact edge because they have to be very light in order to get anything up there, which means that their design safety factors might be a little bit lower. And so I think one of the things that we need to focus on is developing materials and processes and technology to improve that part of it, to make it properly reusable, to the point where it's like an airplane, where it's like a daily occurrence, monthly, or not even monthly, daily, multiple times a day. Going up and down to space is not even thought of as like a major thing anymore. It's like, oh yeah, there's the rocket launcher. Mm-hmm. There's like 12 of them today, as opposed to maybe one a week, maybe.
I think this is huge. And actually, being in the industry for 15 years or so, we've already started to see this shift in mentality. But, 10 years ago, there were no reusable rockets. And in that world, people were very scared of them. They thought reusable rockets, how could it survive twice? It's barely going to survive once. And what I think is really interesting is if you look at failure rates through history, all the way back to, the 60s, the failure rate in our industry is between 3% and 7% that whole time. And it's never been better. But I think reusability is the cheat code, right? It's very, very hard to manufacture things perfectly, even with all this high touch test before launch. It's very hard to manufacture things of this complexity perfectly and repeatably, especially when volumes are not that hard. But actually, even if volumes are big, like in automotive world, you still have that 5 to 7% limit, right? it's still there. We have lemon laws for a reason, right? So so it's hard to get things right on the first try, but reusability breaks that paradigm completely, because now you have flight proven vehicles flying over and over again. And so 10 years ago, the whole industry was very uncomfortable with this idea that reusable rockets could be actually more reliable than one that's flying its maiden voyage. And the thing that I like to draw people's attention to is, okay, well, you say that, I don't have to do this anymore or as much anymore, but 10 years ago, we did it all the time when we were talking to outside customers. And what I said was, look, when you're getting on an aircraft, would you rather fly on its maiden voyage out of the factory, or would you prefer that it's flown 100 times first? And 100% of the time, people would rather go on the one that's flown 100 times first, right? And so we will get there in rocketry. I don't think we're quite there yet, but SpaceX is certainly proving that you can get very, very reliable performance out of a vehicle that's designed to be reused. I also want to go back to the second thing that I blanked on earlier, which was that as we start building things on orbit, what becomes important is the ability to be responsive in our build. One of the reasons that the ISS was so expensive and took so long to build was because it had to be perfect on the first try, and every single launch was this special flower that was carefully orchestrated from the beginning. And that's just not the way we build things on Earth. We build things with a really pretty solid plan, but we also have to be adaptive and responsive in that build as we learn things on the ground, right? So the analogy is you have your initial deployment of materials to start the build, and then things emerge, issues emerge, you might discover something, whatever, and you need to run to Home Depot like that day to keep this thing going and on course, right? We have no ability to do that in space right now. And once availability is up, cost is down, and you can go to any orbit at any time at a great price, then you can start building things this way. So companies like Axiom can, get the 90% answer and actually start building in space, and then allow for that responsiveness to take it the rest of the way.
Yeah, maybe we can get to the point where it might be faster to launch a vehicle versus 3D print something in space.
Yeah, I mean, I think it should be, right? Like you'd want it to be.
Got your Home Depot in space, Andy.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Sounds awesome.
But also having the capability to the whole in space manufacturing aspect of things, and be able to create parts inside of your destination location, right? So inside of Axiom Station, having the ability to manufacture a spare part is super cool, right? Like there was actually, so during Expedition 65 was the first time that a 3D printed part was used in a maintenance operation on ISS. And that was actually really interesting to see that whole conversation play out a little bit, and some of the behind the scenes talks about should we do it, all that kind of stuff, and worked out fine. Through 3D printing the part, it was a filter for so that you could have less smell. They were trying out a new urine processor and stuff, and so having a 3D printed new filter because the original filter wasn't working, and so they installed it. I don't think that actually solved the problem, but it helped with the immediacy of getting some in between thing while they troubleshot more and figured out the proper solution there. So it's that was interesting to see as a first, and that was only just last year, right? We're still in the infancy of having that in space manufacturing and having products be able to be made and immediately readily available after they're produced.
And so in that eventuality, you also have this natural flow of raw materials and finished products that go to and from a location, right? Or, maybe is trash at the end of the day, right? But
you pick up trash and use them as raw materials.
Right.
Yes. Yeah, all the above. Having the flexibility is really critical there, right? Like if it makes more sense to have it fly or having supplies flown, that's definitely an essential part of it.
All right, I think let's shift over to some Q&A. Unless anyone has anything to add about the conversation, just to close it out about this topic. Ready? Okay. So the first question, which was put in the chat, is from Nate from Quindar. And he's asking, what COTS products do you use to help with mission management? What problem does it solve? And what pains do you still have?
Well, I haven't ever used any product, a COTS product. In my past life, we had in-house built products that we used for mission management, mostly for like the planning stages of the mission. I don't know if anybody else has one.
I guess I would just agree with that.
Yeah, in my past life, we used a mix of COTS products that we then heavily customized. So it wasn't truly COTS at that point, and then just completely internally made products. And of course, they never talked to each other, which was always fun.
Yeah, to Hannah's point, I don't think there's anything that's truly COTS available that fits into this niche of managing a spaceflight mission. We're in current development of making a COTS selection and developing a tool that's going to allow us to do our mission management for station planning. So it's not. I just got one of the first deliverables to go test it today, so I'm maybe go do that eventually. But what we're trying to do with our solution is to take not just a small time frame, but also take like the holistic vision of our mission and plan that out with different levels of resource management tied into that already. There's a lot that can go into mission planning. A lot of the current ways mission planning is done is kind of hoping that your cargo manifest makes sense for how it's laid out in terms of its execution. If you fly 30 payloads, you can assign that a year or two before flight, you're going to fly 30 payloads. When you figure out that those 30 payloads are going to take 600 hours to complete every payload to completion, that's not factored into the initial manifesting. So figuring out how your actual execution of your mission matches with the resources available, matches with the cargo, and then launch vehicle capability and availability. That's something that's a problem we're trying to solve with various COTS solutions.
Yeah, Anthony, you have the added complexity of all of the different personal cargo, not just payloads. So it's like packing, but like an overhead compartment, but a lot more complicated than an overhead compartment.
Yeah, and then even furthermore, once those people get to operating, as we're all aware, people don't always execute per the plan. We don't always follow our Outlook calendar exactly how we intended in the day, right? And so the crew members do the exact same thing. So be able to respond and adapt to your mission in real time is actually one of the harder problems, more than just planning out in advance, because then you have an end, a very definitive end of when you need to come home, either from vehicle safety or for crew safety, or from just a cost perspective that I have to get this done so I can have the next thing cycle through and start the next process or the next mission. So you have a definitive end, and so if you're slowing down your operations early or midway through the mission, you got to figure out how do I effectively salvage what to get the rest of it accomplished in time, right?
We had another question, not in the chat, but about in this area that is highly not like unstable and constantly changing, while there is this issue of like the skills gap and public opinion, the public opinion that doesn't necessarily match up with where the industry is. What advice would you give to current undergrads or grad students who want to be future yous, essentially, on how to navigate this, the current landscape, as well as maybe 10 years out? Did we lose Andy?
Yeah, we lost Andy.
I'll message him privately.
I guess I'll start. I would say find a passion and jump right in, and don't lose your passion, because a lot of people get, bummed out when things get hard, and or leave the industry. I know a lot of people have jumped into the industry and left because they've been frustrated. There are ups and downs throughout the industry. I mean, I think all of us here can attest to that. Things will be hard, and you will have very long days, and you will have wins and losses. And just remembering why you're doing what you're doing, and answer that why for yourself, and just keep moving forward, I think is the best advice I can give. And I think the other thing that people often ask is, do you have to have a certain background or a certain degree? And the answer is no. There are jobs for people with any background in this industry. I mean, from communications to business to aerospace to avionics and communications to, you name it, you can find something if you look hard enough and you're passionate enough. That would be my best advice.
I used to say that there's a job for everybody in space. There was a time where I talked to a little girl at a competition. It was a Mars rover building competition that was locally here in Houston, and I asked her if she was interested in doing aerospace, and she's like, "Oh no, I'm more of like an artist." I'm like, well, I mean, like artists play a big role in space flight, and one of the examples I used for her was like, do you know what Pluto looks like? And she's like, yeah, I know what Pluto looks like. Well, did you know that nobody really knew what Pluto looked like until like a few years ago when we actually took a very clear high definition picture, like with the satellite that passed by at New Horizons, I believe, right? And so like before that, all the textbooks were more or less artists' renditions of planets and everything. And so like that, she was like mesmerized, like that was something that she had never considered in her entire life before, of being able to contribute to space with art. Just kind of speaks to the whole, anybody can do anything in space. You just need to figure out what you want to do.
Well, and to go off of that, my job is essentially, I'm a designer. So I have to have the creative artistic side to create CAD models, to create designs that will then get fit onto something. The one difference, I think, between pure art and what I've been doing is that some of my designs have to be backed by math. So it is this weird, interesting, creative solving place where it's like, yes, I'm basically designing three-dimensional sculptures that happen to be applied to rocket engines, right? So I have to have a little bit of the science background and a little bit of the artistic and the creative background in order to actually make something that will work and that will fit, and to get around some of the manufacturing challenges and everything. So it's a really fun balance, I would say. I'd also say that sometimes you have to take yourself out of your day-to-day grind, because as Laura said, there's going to be times when you're working, your like nose is stuck in your computer, your book, on your test stand, whatever. You've been working for hours. You don't necessarily remember what you're working on, or you don't take a minute to appreciate what you're working on. So I recommend taking a step back and just remembering you're working in aerospace, you're working on making a rocket launch, or making the next vehicle for passengers to get around the world. Like, you have to take that step back sometimes, because when you're super deep in the weeds, it's easy to get lost. Whereas if you take a step back and you're like, oh, right, I'm making something that hasn't been done before, is being done in a different way. I have this opportunity that could potentially change the world, or at least change something. That's actually huge, and very few people can look back and say that. Like, I got to help build one of the first rockets for one of the new space companies that actually went to fly. And yes, there are days where it was like 14 hours sitting in front of a computer console being like, why am I doing this? And then taking a step back and remembering, oh yeah, that's a rocket hanging off of an airplane. That's cool. It really helps.
How do you see the split in responsibility between private companies like yourselves and then say like a NASA or other government entity in getting people excited about those kind of things and shifting that kind of public opinion we talked about earlier?
That's like the best question ever. I obviously worked really closely with NASA, and so did Anthony, but when we were working really closely with NASA, SpaceX talked a lot about what they were doing, and NASA shares some of what they're doing. And I think the amount of data and information that is shared with the general public helps with public opinion. And I also think that, NASA's role going forward, because they've had such success with the commercial partnerships, I think their role is going to be pushing the boundaries. What is so expensive that only NASA can do? What is so complicated and so groundbreaking that NASA is solely going to be the one to accomplish that? And commercial companies are taking over, things that they're uniquely capable of doing, like reusable rockets, building private space stations, a lot of the other things that we've talked about. And that's what I see as kind of the future of the partnerships and, the NASA role. I don't know, Anthony, maybe you have something else to add. Andy?
Well, I was going to say something. First of all, sorry I dropped off. It looks like my internet had a brief outage. But I think the right way to think about it is, what does the market look like? And if you can have a real financial return in 5 to 10 years, then that's a place that the commercial sector is very excited about jumping into. And if you can't, then, it's very hard. That these activities take a massive amount of investment, and those people want their money back with multiples of returns. And, if you can't deliver in a reasonable timeline, then it's not going to, really get the commercial traction, I think, or it's much harder to. And that's where NASA comes in, right? So NASA's activities are further out. They're things that are inherently not profitable, but they're exploratory in a way where maybe in 10, 20, 30 years, enough of the legwork and the foundational discovery is complete so that commercial sectors can come in and do things more efficiently in a way that is economically viable. So that's the way I view it. And I think we're seeing that play out right now in the last decade, where, for a long time it was NASA's activities or the activities of nation states going to space, and that was kind of it. And now we're at this point where you have a number of things all kind of coalescing into the moment of today, right? Electronics are smaller and much more powerful. Optics are better. We can start thinking about launching, we have tools like CFD and FEA and all these things that didn't exist. So we can actually build rockets, things that are as complex as rockets with relatively small teams, and we can do it pretty fast. And so now there's an economic equation that actually makes sense from a commercial sector, but it didn't exist 20 years ago, right? So NASA's done that legwork and created this moment, and now they can continue looking at the next thing that's out on the horizon.
Cool. Thank you, everyone. And Peter, I hope that touched upon your question. I tried to frame it in that way. So we're at time, unfortunately. If anyone has any lingering questions, I'm sure you can send them to Payload and we can get you answers. But I would like to thank all of the panelists for their time, and thank you to Laura and Epsilon 3 for sponsoring this webinar. Again, we are Payload, payloodspace.com if you're not subscribed to our newsletter. And yeah, be sure to check out all these great companies that spoke here today as well. And have a great rest of your Wednesday. Thank you all for attending. Hope you learned a lot and enjoyed the conversation.